All right, so get ready because today we're going to dive into a true crime story that is both fascinating and disturbing.
Oh, yeah.
We're going back to Phoenix, Arizona in the early 90s.
Okay.
Two young women, Angela Brasso, she was 21 years old, a tech worker, and Melanie Burness, 17, a high school student.
Wow.
They were found murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And their cases, as we're going to see, are connected in this really creepy web of details.
Yeah.
A suspect with a double life and an investigation that took decades to solve.
Right.
And it really relied on luck and some really groundbreaking forensics.
It is fascinating. You know how it's almost like a puzzle, and it slowly starts to reveal a picture of the killer.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who was able to really compartmentalize this dark side of themselves. People who knew him in one world would never suspect him of being able to do such horrific things.
Okay, well, let's start with Angela. She was found near the Arizona Canal.
Right.
A lot of people would go there for walks or bike rides, so it wasn't exactly isolated.
Yeah.
But the scene itself, the crime scene, was brutal. She had been stabbed multiple times. She was mutilated and even decapitated.
That level of violence really does point to a deeply disturbed individual. You know, it's more than just ending someone's life. There's rage, there's control, and possibly even an attempt to depersonalize the victim through the mutilation.
Yeah, it seemed personal, you know?
Yeah.
The brutality. So, of course, investigators started with those closest to Angela.
Yeah, that's standard in these types of cases, right? The perpetrator is often someone the victim knows.
Right, and they had a couple potential suspects. There was Angela's boyfriend, Joe. Some friends described their relationship as rocky. And there was this strange late-night phone call between them right before Angela disappeared. That obviously raised some red flags.
Of course.
They also looked into one of Angela's former professors. He admitted to having feelings for her, and I think it was his military background that kind of caught their attention. But ultimately, both men were ruled out as suspects.
You know, investigators were also looking for someone who might have had the knowledge or training to inflict such specific injuries. You know, like the stab wound to Angela's back. It was very precise. This could mean they were familiar with anatomy or weaponry.
Yeah, it's just disturbing to think someone could have those kinds of skills and use them for such a horrible purpose. But then, almost a year later, another young woman is found murdered, 17-year-old Melanie Burness. And she was found near the same canal as Angela.
So this is where the case starts to take a turn. While there are some similarities to Angela's murder, the location, the fact that a knife was used there were signs of sexual assault. There are also some distinct differences that really stand out.
Like the turquoise bodysuit?
Yeah.
The one Melanie was found wearing that didn't belong to her?
Right.
And the initials that were carved into her chest.
Exactly. Those details, the bodysuit and the markings. They suggest there's a ritualistic element, possibly tied to the killer's fantasies. It's almost like he was staging the scene, exerting this very specific type of control over his victim.
It almost feels like the killer wanted to leave his signature, you know, like a calling card. And eventually, DNA evidence confirmed that Angela and Melanie were both murdered by the same person. But even with that link, the case went cold for almost 20 years.
This really shows the limitations of early DNA technology. The national database was just starting to come online, and even with the killer's DNA profile, they couldn't find a match.
It must have been so frustrating for investigators and devastating for the families, you know, to not have any answers for so long. But then a new cold case squad took over, and that's when things started to shift. They called in the Vidocq Society. Have you heard of them?
Yes, they are an incredible group. It's a volunteer organization made up of forensic experts, criminologists and psychologists. They offer their expertise free of charge to help law enforcement solve cold cases. And they've got a really impressive track record. They've been involved in over 100 cold cases, offering a new perspective and, access to these cutting-edge techniques that might not have been available when these crimes first happened. Actually, they have a success rate of around 30%, which is really significant for cases that have gone cold.
Wow, 30%. That's amazing. And in this case, they called in Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. She was a pioneer in forensic genealogy. And by using Y chromosome DNA and genealogy databases, she was able to narrow the suspect pool down to one surname.
Wow.
Miller. I mean, it's incredible how this technology can revitalize a cold case.
It really is. Dr. Fitzpatrick is a leader in this field. The Y chromosome is passed down from father to son. So by analyzing it, you can trace the killer's lineage and find potential relatives in these genealogy databases. It's becoming an increasingly important tool for law enforcement, especially in cases where traditional DNA analysis just hits a dead end.
So they start looking into the Millers who had been connected to the case. And a name pops up again. Brian Patrick Miller. He had actually been on their radar before because of a tip. Someone had reported seeing a turquoise bodysuit in his home.
Oh, wow.
But at the time, they thought he was too young to fit the profile.
Oh, that's tragic that such a key piece of information was overlooked, just because of assumptions about the killer's age. It shows how important it is to keep an open mind and to re-examine every detail
Right.
as new technologies and information become available.
And as they dug deeper into Brian Patrick Miller's past, things took a really strange turn. He had a prior conviction for a similar stabbing,
Wow.
which was a huge red flag. But it was the details about his personal life that were truly disturbing. This is where the whole double life aspect of the case starts to become really clear. Miller had this persona in the steampunk community.
Right.
It's this subculture that blends Victorian aesthetics with technology.
Interesting.
And he called himself the zombie hunter and would drive around in a car decorated with fake blood and props.
Like,
It was like this bizarre performance, a facade hiding this much darker reality. It's like
yeah.
he was living in these two completely separate worlds,
Right.
compartmentalizing his life in a way that I don't know how you could possibly understand. And during the investigation, they found some of his writing, and it was filled with violent fantasies that were eerily similar to the crimes he was suspected of committing.
That's scary to see how fantasy can turn into reality, especially for someone with underlying psychological issues. These fantasies might have been a way for him to mentally rehearse the crimes, desensitizing him to the violence and fueling his dark desires.
And I remember reading about Miller's ex-wife. She told the police about his plan. He had written down this really detailed account of how he wanted to kidnap, torture, and murder a woman.
Oh, my God.
It's just so chilling how his fantasies were so similar to the real-life horrors that he inflicted on Angela and Melanie.
Yeah, that plan is a very important piece of evidence, not just for the content, but also for the insight it gives into Miller's mind,
Right.
even before the murders happened. It shows that these violent tendencies weren't sudden. They were already there and potentially growing stronger over time.
It's terrifying that someone could keep such darkness hidden for so long. But this is where the investigators were really smart. They knew they needed more than circumstantial evidence and old tips to get a conviction, so they came up with this clever undercover operation.
Interesting.
It was brilliant, really.
Yeah.
They knew about Miller's personality, his fascination with authority,
Right.
so they created a scenario that would appeal to that, which would give them the chance to get his DNA without making him suspicious. They basically posed as potential employers and offered Miller a security job, something that would play into his need for control and power. And during this fake interview, they managed to collect his DNA from a cup he had thrown away. I mean, you have to admire their resourcefulness.
Yeah, that's incredible. This kind of creative thinking is so important in cold cases. The detectives knew Miller's weaknesses, and they used them to get the evidence they needed.
And of course, the DNA was a match. They finally had the confirmation they had been waiting for. Brian Patrick Miller was arrested for the murders of Angela and Melanie.
It's important to point out that even with all the evidence against him, Miller pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense team argued that his childhood abuse had caused mental health problems, including dissociative disorder.
Right, so they were saying that he was this troubled individual who was scarred by his past, and that he wasn't in control of his actions. But the prosecution had a different perspective.
Right, they focused on Miller's calculated actions and his efforts to hide the crimes. They emphasized that his fantasies, his writings, and his prior conviction all pointed to someone who was predatory and calculated.
And in the end, the judge agreed. Miller was found guilty on all 6 counts. 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 2 counts of attempted sexual assault. He was sentenced to death.
The verdict and the sentence showed just how serious his crimes were. The impact on the families was huge. The judge said that Miller was completely aware of what he was doing and that he was still a danger to society.
But the story doesn't end there. Even now, Miller's a suspect in other unsolved murders. His reign of terror might have gone on for much longer than anyone realized.
It's scary to think that there are serial killers who can operate for years, leaving behind a trail of victims. The fact that Miller is still being investigated shows how important it is for law enforcement to be vigilant and to work together.
It really does.
Yeah. Makes you wonder, right, how someone like Miller, who seemed so normal to the people who knew him, could do such awful things. And what role did those dark fantasies play, in making his violence escalate?
Yeah, it's something I keep thinking about as we learn more about this case. I mean, he didn't just snap. There were signs, right? Warning signs. His ex-wife talked about his behavior. His own mother even told the police about that disturbing plan. What if someone had intervened? Could they have prevented this?
That's a tough one to answer, for sure.
That's
It
tough.
definitely makes you think about the times when maybe people could have stepped in and done something, you know? I think it shows how important it is for law enforcement and mental health professionals and social services to all work together.
Yeah.
We have to be able to spot these warning signs better and have ways to deal with people who might be dangerous before they hurt anyone.
It's like a perfect storm, all these different factors coming together to create this awful outcome. But changing gears a bit, I was really surprised by how much forensic science has advanced since the early 90s. I mean, they were able to solve this case decades later using DNA technology and genealogy research. It's amazing.
Haley, and these advancements are still happening all the time. Think about what that means for solving crimes in the future.
Yeah.
It's a total game changer. Cases that would have stayed unsolved mysteries now have a chance of being solved.
It does give you hope, right? That even if it takes a while, justice is still possible. But there's something else I wanted to talk about. We've discussed Miller's double life, his fantasies, his crimes, but what about the internet and the dark side of online culture? Could that have had an influence on him?
That's a really important question and one that researchers are looking into more and more. The internet has a lot of benefits, but it can also be a place where people find extremist views, violent content, and communities that think deviant behavior is okay or even encourage it. It's complicated, and there are no easy answers, but we need to be aware of it, especially as the world becomes more and more digital.
Yeah, that's a pretty scary thought to end on, but it's important to think about. This case makes us face the worst parts of human nature and the challenges we have as a society.
It reminds us that even with all the technology and progress we've made, the fight against the darkness in humanity is far from over the case. Patrick Miller shows that very clearly.
It really shows you how psychology, technology, and just good detective work all come together in this case. Each one was so important in finally bringing Miller to justice.
Yeah, it really shows how far we've come with forensic science. Imagine if this had all happened even 10 years earlier, without the DNA technology and the genealogy databases. Miller might never have been caught.
That's a scary thought. It's to really appreciate those investigators, and the forensic experts who never gave up on finding Angela and Melanie's killer. Even after so many years, they were determined to find answers.
Exactly. And it shows why it's so important to keep researching and developing these fields. Who knows what new technologies we'll have 5, 10, 20 years from now? The possibilities are incredible.
Yeah, it's true. Who knows what the future holds, but right now I think we need to remember the victims in all of this. Angela and Melanie, their lives were cut short. They never got to have a future.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
It's easy to get caught up in the investigation, and the killer's psychology,
Mm.
but we can't forget the real people who were hurt. The families and friends left behind, all the grief and loss that reaches so many people, not just those who are close to Angela and Melanie.
That's true. It makes you realize that behind every true crime case, there are real people whose lives are changed forever. And even though justice was served in this case, I don't think the pain of what happened will ever truly go away.
That's a really powerful point.
Yeah.
I think it shows that we need to do more than just catch criminals after the fact. We need to create a society where these horrible things are less likely to happen in the first place.
I totally agree. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our depth dive today. It's been a long journey, hasn't it? We've gone from the darkest parts of humanity to the hope that comes from advances in forensic science.
It has, and I think it's given us a lot to think about.
To everyone listening, we hope you found our look at the Brian Patrick Miller case informative and interesting. Remember, learning and understanding the world around us is something we do together. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.